All right, welcome everyone to our Tree Week webinar today. Today we are in luck. We're being joined by Dr. Jacob Muller, who's here at the University of Kentucky. He's an assistant professor of extension forestry, and he wears a lot of different hats here in the department. But one of the reasons why we're lucky to have him here is his expertise in climate change and what that's going to mean for our forests going forward. We're here celebrating Tree Week. If you're joining us today, it's because you love trees and you want to celebrate them, but you also want to promote them and their health. And so, Dr. Moeller, thanks for joining us to be talking a little bit about what we've got in store in the future.
Great. Thanks, Alan. It's great to be here and great to see everyone here. I'm excited to get to share this presentation with you all and look forward to answering some questions afterwards.
Wonderful. Thank you again. And if you have questions, feel free to put those in the chat.
Okay. Look good?
Looks great.
All right. Again, welcome everyone. It's great to be here. So today I'm going to be talking about a topic that I spend a lot of time thinking about, and it's part of my research program, but also part of my extension program, that being trying to help landowners, managers, folks who are interested in the sustainability and resiliency of their forests, and helping them think about how we can manage those forests to create more resiliency and sustainability within those forests. And so today I'm going to be talking about several things, and I think we'll go ahead and kick off. So the title of my talk, I guess it's kind of changed a little bit, but responding to climate change in Kentucky's woodlands. And there's a lot of partners down there on the bottom. Those are partners that I may mention over the course of the next 30 or 40 minutes. But whether I do or not, they're important partners that have been working with UK and folks across Kentucky and helping us address this important topic. Right. Oops. All right. So why are we concerned about this? Why are we responding? Well, it's because climate is changing, and I half jokingly say even in Kentucky, but it's true. I'm having there we go. Since the 1970s or so, warming began accelerating everywhere, even in the states that were already warming faster. The speed of warming across the lower 48 states more than tripled from around 1/10 of a degree Fahrenheit per decade over the last 100-year period to nearly 1/2 a degree per decade since the 1970s. In fact, all 49 states that were analyzed as part of this study have warmed by at least 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit since the 1970s. And Kentucky has warmed nearly 3 degrees as averaged across the state. Some areas having experienced more warming, some having experienced less warming. And this is kind of averaged across the state. The concentration of heat trapping CO2 in the atmosphere has increased around 30% since the first Earth Day, which was in 1970. And CO2 has increased, and temperature continues to follow suit. Extreme temperatures are projected to increase. Whoops. Excuse me. Oh, there we go. And so this graph, or these two graphs, kind of show some of that accelerating temperatures and the rates of change since the 1970s. Right, there we go. Extreme temperatures are projected to increase even more than average temperatures in many areas. Both the coldest and warmest daily temperatures of the year are expected to increase by nearly 5 degrees Fahrenheit in most areas by the middle of the century, rising to nearly 10 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. There are large projected changes in the number of days exceeding 90 degrees, which I don't think any of us are too excited about. But for instance, there are about 20 to 30 more days per year with a maximum of over 90 degrees Fahrenheit in most areas by the middle of the century under this RCP 8.5, which is a high emissions scenario, climate scenario, with increases of 40 to 50 days in much of the Southeast, including Kentucky. This is consistent with widespread warming. There are 20 to 30 fewer days per year with a minimum temperature below freezing in the northern and eastern parts of the nation, with decreases of more than 40 to 50 days in much of the western United States. Increases in precipitation are projected for Kentucky, most likely during the winter and spring months. Changes in summer and fall precipitation are less certain, however. Continuing increases in frequency and intensity of extreme precipitation events are also projected. This potentially increasing the frequency and intensity of floods. At the same time, the intensity of future droughts is projected to increase because of the increases in evaporation rates due to rising temperatures. And this is in combination with naturally occurring periods of below rainfall. So these potential increases in the intensity of both floods and droughts are going to have important implications for important sectors of Kentucky's economy, including agriculture, tourism, as well as natural resources management. This chart here shows the observed and projected changes in average temperature for the state of Kentucky under two emissions pathways. Each line represents a possible pathway based on assumptions about future greenhouse gas emissions, social behavior, and policy. The bars on the right show the likely ranges in temperature by the end of the century relative to the 1986 to 2005 average, as shown in this study. We can see that that light bluish green shaded line represents a low emission scenario, this RCP 4.5, and that's a relatively low amount of change that would be driven by significantly reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And that top red line represents a higher emission scenario, that RCP 8.5, and the highest amount of change that would be driven by steadily increasing amounts of greenhouse gas by the end of this century. These two models, these RCP scenarios, bracket most of the future emissions as outlined by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in their evaluation of these emission scenarios. These emission scenarios are used by these downscaled climate models to project changes at the regional level as well as at the state level. And so we're going to be looking at kind of some of those downscaled models. And I think it's important to get kind of a grasp of these changes before we start actually talking about the impacts that it's going to have on our forests and the vulnerabilities that we are projecting these changes to have. So we're going to look through a few slides next that are going to show kind of a range of conditions based off of these two models, these RPC 4.5 and these RPC 8.5 emission scenarios. So here I'm presenting the data from two what we call global circulation models, or GCMs. And those two models are the CCSM4. Not that this matters much to you, but these are the models that we use, along with a Hadley model. And these exhibit a wide range of sensitivities to CO2 in the atmosphere. This one on the left, the CCSM4 model with the RPC 4.5 scenario, so it's kind of a mouthful, but this is our low emissions scenario, represents the least amount of temperature change, while that high emissions, that Hadley model with that RPC 8.5, which is the high emissions scenario, represents kind of the most extreme temperature change. But together, the combination of these exhibit the full range of potential future climate scenarios that we perceive through these models, both the low emissions models as well as the high emissions models. And we're talking about CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions when we're talking about emissions. Right. So if we zoom in on Kentucky here at the end of this century, we can expect to see an increase of nearly 4 degrees Fahrenheit on average. So the annual average temperatures on the low emission side, and potentially up to 10.6 degrees on average in the high emission scenario. When we look at the warmest months of the year, so kind of right in the heart of our summer months, under these low emission scenarios, projecting a little over 3 degrees Fahrenheit, all the way up to 11 degrees Fahrenheit at the end of this century in the high emission scenario. When we look at the coldest months of the year, right, we're still seeing projected to see increases in temperature with the low emission scenario seeing an average in the coldest months of 3.2 degrees Fahrenheit. And then on the higher end, under those high emission scenarios, an increase of 5 degrees Fahrenheit. For some of you, it might sound nice that we don't have as cold of temperatures, but it can certainly have some implications. We're going to talk about that. If you're a maple syrup farmer, for instance, and you rely on this freezing and thawing cycle to produce maple syrup through the sap flow in our maple trees, this is something that you're sure to be tuned into. The projected changes in the warmest months, whoops, I'm going backwards. The projected changes in annual precipitation under the low emission scenarios is still a pretty dramatic increase in total precipitation. We showed that figure of increasing precipitation likely in the winter and spring months. We could see 4.5 inches increase under the low emissions, and actually less precipitation under these high emission scenarios. And these again are this range of potential changes that we could see in the future from these models. And these are kind of on both the extreme, the low emissions scenario where we significantly reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, to the other high emissions where we're essentially not changing course. When we look at growing season precipitation, and this is really important, obviously this is tree week, and we're all aware that trees rely on these important resources, water being one of the most important resources, and having access to that during the growing season is of the utmost importance. Right? So when we look again at this range of the low emission scenario, seeing a slight increase, but really not, the model is suggesting not much of a change to the high emission scenario, and this is one that's worrisome, is a significant decrease in the amount of precipitation during the growing season. Right? We know there's a lot of uncertainty associated with these models. The range is quite incredible between low emissions and high emissions scenarios. And along with the timing and the intensity of these precipitation events and the changes in our temperature, there's a lot of uncertainty in how that's going to look, and some uncertainty in how our forests are going to be impacted on that. or from that rather. But thinking about this in terms of a forest manager or forest planner or practitioner, someone who spends time planning the forest, whether it's an urban forest or a forest out in the Daniel Boone National Forest, forest managers have always had to plan for the unexpected, plan for that uncertainty. For insect and pest outbreaks, for droughts and floodings when it does rain. Climate change and associated disturbances are incorporated into this planning and management, just like many of the other threats. So to the average forest planner, climate change might simply be another drop in the bucket for, or we might have this array of possible management goals. And we have to think about managing in the context of a changing climate while still focused on these management goals and objectives that we have, right? So I like to say we're not necessarily managing at climate change or for climate change, but we're kind of managing in the context of a changing climate, right? And that's how a forest manager might interpret this and think about this. And so this next part of the presentation, we're going to jump into kind of thinking about things in terms of managing for forests and trees from a management perspective, and the things that we would need to consider given these climate change scenarios that we just described. I'm showing a couple of these different vulnerability assessments. These are really, excuse me, quite comprehensive vulnerability assessments that were developed by the USDA Forest Service. Then they span broadly across the region of Kentucky. You'll see on that figure on the left, Kentucky's kind of cut out, and there's a central hardwoods vulnerability assessment, and there's a central Appalachian vulnerability assessment to our northeast. And you can see kind of that outline right along the Ohio River there. That's not because there's a dramatic change in the forest type or any differences across that region. It's just that the program that developed these vulnerability assessments is in the northern region, and Kentucky we're part of the southern region. So we can still pull a lot of information from these vulnerability assessments that were developed. And I will mention that we are currently developing a central and southern Appalachian vulnerability assessment to complement these two that currently exist that span Kentucky. But I mention this is because we're going to pull some vulnerabilities and discuss those that come straight from these publications. And we also use models, and this is an interesting model also developed by the Forest Service called Climate Change Tree Atlas. And you can see on the figure on the right, there's the tree atlas, and there's also a bird atlas. But these are models that look at projected changes in climate and how tree species are going to respond to those changes. And so you can look at these different climate scenarios, some of the models that I mentioned above, the Hadley model, and look and see how tree species might move on the landscape in the future, or at least how their preferred habitat might move. Right. The changes in temperature and precipitation that we discussed are expected to have wide-ranging effects on trees and tree species here in Kentucky. There's many challenges that we're going to face, but perhaps there may be some opportunities as well. And so we're going to walk through a couple of these vulnerabilities and perhaps a couple opportunities and discuss how they might relate to us here in Kentucky and how we think about managing forests, right? So number one, longer growing season, right? This is a direct effect of changing temperatures, right? The length of the growing season is defined here as the number of days between the last spring freeze and the first autumn freeze, right? Warmer average temperatures in every season has already resulted in a longer growing season here in Kentucky, which is about a week longer in 2020 compared to the end of the 19th century. At the end of this century, models project 28 to 30 more days in the growing season here in Kentucky. And this is under the low emissions climate scenario. Under the high emissions climate scenario, we could see anywhere from 40 to 50 more days under this high emission scenario within the growing season. Right? There is evidence of both worldwide and regionally that increases in growing season length during the past century are partly responsible for observed increases in forest growth and carbon sequestration. Right? So we talk about vulnerabilities, but we also talk about opportunities. Right? This could fall under both kind of those vulnerabilities as well as the opportunities category, right? Longer growing seasons can result, unfortunately, in false springs. So when we have warmer temperatures that cue plants to form early buds and start the sap flow through the tree, this can result in some vulnerabilities. When we receive an early cold snap, a rapid dip in temperatures, these newly formed buds or flowers, or even the tree itself, are at increased risk of frost damage. Longer and warmer growing seasons may also lead to increases or increased risk of moisture stress, especially later in the growing season. It may seem contradictory to expect both an increase in precipitation and an increase in drought, but timing is everything. And changes to the hydrologic cycle in winter and spring can contribute to worsening conditions in the summer and fall. So in winter and spring, we see earlier runoff, but we're also seeing fewer rain events overall, with more rain coming down in these single large episodic precipitation events. And that's contributing to more storm runoff rather than renewing the soil. And summer months are expected to warm even more than the winter months, as we discussed a few minutes ago. And this is causing more moisture to be lost through evaporation and through the process of transpiration. Warmer temperatures and variability in precipitation will likely result in great stress or even mortality to trees that are particularly on drought-prone soils. Trees with greater moisture requirements and sites that are exposed to greater warming, or sites that are overstocked. Increased risk of wildfire, right? The authors of this study used models that pulled together a series of downscaled GCMs, those global climate models, in combination with a number of other fire frequency models to project changes in potential fire probability under these two scenarios, right? The high emission scenario, the RPC 4.5, and that higher emission scenario, the RCP 8.5. We can see under the high emission scenario, which is shown here in this figure, that fire probability is expected to increase in Kentucky 75 to 100% by the end of this century. So a significantly increased risk of fire. Again, we're talking about probability of fire, so it's likeliness or likelihood to occur, not necessarily talking about the severity of the fire, but those two can be related. CO2 fertilization. Right? With longer growing seasons, CO2 fertilization could be a silver lining in all this. As more carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere, plants are able to increase their photosynthesis and increase their water use efficiency in this process. So the diagram here shows the stomatal pore in a plant leaf where CO2 enters and water is exiting. So as more CO2 enters, that opening of the pore gets smaller and smaller, reducing the amount of water that is lost during transpiration. Although this would be great in the perfect ideal world where trees would take in more CO2 and make more oxygen using less water, there are some limitations that have been identified in the research. Limited sink strength, meaning that trees acclimate to increased growth, and more CO2 doesn't necessarily equal more growth after a certain point. Additionally, the ability of trees to capitalize on increasing CO2 varies by species and it varies by site quality, and any potential increases might be offset by drought stress and other disturbances. And so again, this kind of double-edged sword where there may be some opportunities, but certainly we expect to have these vulnerabilities and susceptibilities to these changes in climate. Here we're talking about this idea of capability for tree species. And capability is a new metric that describes the capability of tree species to cope with changing climate based on the species' current abundance, its habitat change class, and its adaptability to climate change, right? So when species respond the same way under both climate scenarios, we have more confidence in those future projections. We have more certainty when the models are in agreement. And so these species with this good climate change capability under these different scenarios include some of Kentucky's most common tree species, such as yellow poplar, sugar maple, white oak, red maple, eastern red cedar, black oak. Right? Unfortunately, there are also some important species that are expected to do poorly under these scenarios, right? And under these models, pignut hickory, American beech, white ash, Virginia pine, these species that have this poor capability. And so certainly when we start thinking about how we can manage our forests, we need to have a good understanding and have reliable models that can help guide our management when we start talking about whether we're planting trees or we're favoring certain species of trees. Across the US, there's evidence that tree species and other organisms may be moving northward and upward in elevation. Right? Evidence also suggests that ranges may be constricting as species retreat at the southern edge of their ranges without a corresponding expansion at the northern edge. So you can envision species habitats on the south moving more northward at the same time, not necessarily seeing that movement. So you're seeing this constricting of species ranges, which can be certainly problematic when we're talking about trying to manage for particular species along with managing for the competition of other species. And so at some point, we need to consider how the species is going to look on the landscape and what sort of things we can do for management to promote that species. Right? Extreme events such as heavy rains, heat waves, and windstorms, flooding, and droughts. These are all projected to become more frequent and severe as a result of climate change. Unfortunately, we've seen a number of these events taking place here in Kentucky over the last couple of years. Certainly, we've seen some of these extreme events, such as these flash droughts that we experienced last summer in June and July, followed by this incredible episodic precipitation event at the end of July last year. And so you have these real flashy events, so flash flooding or flash droughts followed quickly by flash flooding, right? And these can be incredibly problematic from a forest and a tree's perspective. Excuse me. Because these events are typically distinct from long-term average climates, these events are especially hard to model. But they are becoming there are already becoming challenges in land management, and the impacts of extreme events is directly tied to the ability of the ecosystem to tolerate changing disturbance regimes. And so when we say disturbance regimes, that's the historical interaction of disturbance such as fire, drought, flooding, and its relationship with the forest. And certainly invasive species and invasive plants. Non-native invasive species are already a major threat to many forests in Kentucky. And I know many of you are well aware of that and aware of the problems that we have here in Kentucky and across the region. Many invasive plants will benefit from climate change due to their broad habitat requirements, earlier leaf out, and more aggressive colonization of new areas. Warmer temperatures and earlier springs are already having a positive impact on invasives. And I say positive, they're favorable to invasive plants, right? Risk is especially high where invasives are established nearby and in systems that are already stressed and struggling. So it's clear that there are many direct and indirect impacts and effects of climate change, and that interactions between these different threats and stressors can shift and amplify ecosystem processes in expected ways, such as when drought increases the susceptibility of a tree to a particular pest or a pathogen, or in unexpected ways that we haven't yet uncovered yet. Right, so it has this multiplier impact where climate change can be creating kind of these 1, 2, even 3 punches to a tree and its ability to withstand the stresses that climate change might impose. Right, and so a number of these events and these vulnerabilities are creating management challenges. And these are things that managers are actively considering in how we can prepare our forests for the future, both urban forests here in our parks in Fayette County, as well as all the wildland forests across Kentucky and across the region. And it's creating these unique challenges that are amplifying disturbances and creating conditions that make it difficult for ecosystems to naturally respond and adapt to those future and changing conditions. So what can we do to address these challenges and manage for this uncertainty to ensure sustainability and productive forests? There are a number of things that we can do, but there are 2 broad options that we have to respond to climate change, right? We can kind of group these into 2 broad categories. This adaptation category, so actions to reduce the vulnerability of systems to climate change and its effects, as well as mitigation, right? And these are actions that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and enhance the carbon sinks. And so it's helpful for me to think about these responding to climate change kind of in these 2 groups, right? And we'll quickly kind of go through these 2 groups with the final 10 minutes here of this presentation. But I'd like to quickly talk about mitigation, right? So mitigation in this context is simply reducing atmospheric carbon, right? Why do we care about carbon? As I mentioned before, under these climate scenarios with carbon emissions, under the high emissions and the low emissions scenario, temperature changes are directly linked to the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So when we see increases in carbon in the atmosphere, temperature will follow suit. Right, so you can see in this figure kind of the different trajectories or projections based off of low emissions or even lower emissions scenario, which is kind of the baseline now for trying to limit any extreme change. Right, so what's being done to reduce the amount of carbon? There are companies and billion-dollar companies, oil and gas companies and energy companies that are investing billions of dollars into capturing carbon in the atmosphere and storing it deep down and under impermeable layers of the Earth's crust. There are certainly benefits to this, right? Might be an important part of managing and reducing the amount of carbon, but it's not necessarily sustainable. It's not a way that we're going to solve the problem, right? I think we're all kind of aware of that. From a forest perspective, we all know that forests are kind of this perfect example of carbon sequestration and storage, right? Thinking about forest in terms of mitigation is an area that's been talked about a lot lately, and I'm sure you've heard of these topics, right? Because forests have truly perfected carbon capture. We're not building these crazy big infrastructures. Forestry is an important established science. There's forest industry and the land itself. It creates long-term opportunities for storing carbon, and there's many secondary benefits in the forest, from oxygen, obviously, creating biodiversity, recreation, and all these co-benefits, including the ecological and economic benefits of thinking about forests as these mitigative tool to help reduce, right? There are certainly other things and many other things that would need to happen, but I'm not a social scientist, and I'm not a policymaker, and my expertise truly lies in speaking in terms of forests and what we can do to help create more resilient forests, at the same time hoping to help mitigate some of the carbon that is in the atmosphere. Right. I'm sure most of you are all familiar, but I thought, given this is Tree Week, we could have just a little quick recap on the process, this magical process of capturing carbon, right? Through this incredible process of photosynthesis, where we have CO2 along with sunlight and water that's entering into the plant, and you have this chemical process that occurs, right? This photosynthesis, where we have 6 CO2 molecules and 6 oxygen molecules, and it goes through this photosynthesis process to create 2 byproducts, right? These sugars, the sucrose, along with oxygen, right? And that sugar is what goes towards the building blocks for the tree, developing the biomass of the tree, and that's where the carbon is stored. And you can see that C right there in the very first part of the sugar chemical equation there. At the same time, we realize that plants do release some CO2 in this process, but this is a carbon cycle that we're talking about. Why are we talking about this at this present time? There's a lot of interest in this idea of carbon credits and carbon markets. We could spend days, certainly an entire lecture, talking about this. We're developing some extension materials on this if you're interested in this area. But we're not going to go deep into this right now, but it's certainly a hot topic. We're going to spend the rest of the time talking about adaptation, right? And it's this adjustment of systems in response to a changing climate, right? Adaptations, they're these intentionally designed actions that address climate change impacts and vulnerabilities to meet our goals, right? They're ecosystem-based activities that build on sustainable management, conservation practices, and restoration activities. We think of adaptation in terms of this spectrum, right? From reducing the impacts of climate change and maintaining current conditions, all the way up to promoting change and facilitating an adaptive response. So we like to think about adaptation along this spectrum, from resisting the impacts of climate change, right? So trying to maintain these conditions, all the way up to intentionally facilitating change. And as forest managers, this is how we think about responding to a changing climate. we can think about it kind of along this gradient here in this figure of reducing the impacts all the way up to promoting change in this transition, right? I'm not going to be able to begin to describe kind of everything that each one of these options is included in each one of these options, but I'm going to try to quickly introduce this to you, understanding that there are a lot of great resources, and you can see down here in the corner there's a citation to Muller et al. 2007, and these are ideas that have been developed over the last couple of decades that have been built upon by folks in forest management to think about how we take these ideas and apply them in a management sense, right? So from the resistance, right, improving defenses of a system against anticipated changes, or directly defending against disturbance in order to maintain relatively unchanged conditions. Right? What does this look like? Right? There's a lot going on in this figure, but just to quickly describe what a resistance option would look like is trying to maintain those conditions, but at the same time realizing that those changes in climate that we discussed earlier, right, is going to be pushing that forest or potentially in a different trajectory, right? Over time, our adaptation activities and these silvicultural tactics that we employ is going to become is going to increase over time in the amount of intensity, the timing that we have to go in to try to maintain these conditions. How long is it realistic? Well, that depends on a number of things, right? So we move along this gradient to this idea of resilience and this option for adaptation. The intention of this is to accommodate some degree of change, but to return to that similar condition, right? We can think about this classic resiliency example of the rubber band. We're expanding the rubber band, but it's coming back or snapping back to that condition, right? And there's endless amounts of examples describing resiliency, but the idea is to maintain these conditions, but allow some deviation from those conditions, right? This could take a whole bunch of different forms depending on the forest that you're managing or the area that you're trying to manage, whether it's in an urban setting like here at some of our parks in Lexington, or deep out at Robinson Forest in Eastern Kentucky, right? It's going to look different. We're going to have different activities, but the idea is to have kind of this flexibility in the option that hopefully will reduce the amount of effort that we need to put into this management system in order to still achieve our goals. Right. So our last one is kind of this most aggressive approach to changing climates, and this is intentionally accommodating change to enable ecosystems to adaptively respond to changing and new conditions. Right. This one is, there may be some things embedded in this option that you've heard of, such as assisted migration, right? Relocation of an exotic species. That sounds kind of aggressive, like there's lots of opportunities for problems to arise, and there certainly can be, but this is the most aggressive approach. And when we think about this in terms of our trajectories within management, we're changing the goalpost, right? Or where that goalpost is. We're changing the function of that forest, whether it's the species composition or different structures embedded in that forest, to try to reduce the amount of effort needed to maintain that, right? And I know this is kind of ambiguous and a broad description of these adaptation options, but hopefully you can get kind of the sense of what this gradient of options is trying to achieve, right? There are some great resources. I'm just scratching the surface But I would recommend, if you're interested, looking at this other US Forest Service publication called Forest Adaptation Resources, Climate Change Tools and Approaches for Land Managers. It has lots of uses besides just for land managers, lots of interesting things, and it's a large document published by the Forest Service that goes into detail on these adaptation options and those actions that can actually be taken to accommodate or to achieve those, right? Again, there's a lot of uncertainty, right? But we have to accept that as managers, that we're going to be managing for uncertainty and build that into our management. And that means probably trying to accommodate some sort or some amount of change in the system, right? Maybe we have to redefine what our goals and objectives are and how we might be able to achieve those. And we're also studying this. I just want to quickly mention this, that we're testing these 3 different options out at Robinson Forest as part of this adaptive silviculture for climate change network, right? The site out at Robinson Forest is one of 11 sites across the US and Canada. And I wish I had more time to spend kind of going through this, but we have we have a lot of information about our project. And if you're interested in learning more about, we call it the Ask Network, I would be happy to share more information. And hopefully, if you're interested at some point, you'll be able to get out to Robinson Forest and take a tour of this and kind of see this resistance, resilience, and transition in real life, right? Out at in Eastern Kentucky, some great partners involved with this project, from Kentucky Division of Forestry, the Forest Service, NRCS, Kentucky Forest Industries Association. And it's about bringing together science and management to have on the ground impacts out in the forest and achieve this adaptation goal that we have set forth, right? Whether it's supporting the timber industry, managing for a diverse, sustainable ecosystem, mitigating the risk of invasives, right? Promoting all of these co-benefits that we talked about, and understanding the role that mitigation and carbon has in the forest, right? And so we can study this along with all sorts of other things, from wildlife to water and soil. And I look forward to sharing more information about this with you, right? Some quick final thoughts, then we're going to wrap up. What can we do to help forests prepare for climate change? Right, and we're going to list 10 things real quickly, right? Protect water and soils, right? Improve the ability and capacity of your trees to tolerate and resist insects and diseases. Prevent and control invasive plants that threaten your native plants. Control young trees of desirable species, right? And that's important. Protect rare and sensitive plants and animal communities. Promoting diversity, right, and heterogeneity in your forest. So both tree species and tree sizes and structures. Consider how trees that you plant today are going to grow in the future, right? And we could use the Tree Atlas tool to help guide that information. Monitor your woodlands and its impacts and effects of your management, and be flexible. Modify management, modify the ways that you interact with your forest and your trees in order to achieve those goals, right? So with that, I think I went a little longer, Alan, but thanks for joining. I think we've got some questions that I think we've got a few minutes to try to answer.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Muller. And before we get to your questions, we definitely have some in the chat. I want to encourage folks, let us know what you think of this webinar series. We'd love to hear from you. So in the chat, I'm putting a link to a survey. And also, I wanted to let everyone know that these webinars are recorded, and you'll be able to catch up on Dr. Muller's presentation, other presentations if you want. And I put the link to that in the chat, but at the Kentucky Forest Health YouTube page. So make sure you check out this. Let us know what you think. And then I also want to give a shout out to our other webinars in the series, especially the 3 that we have coming soon. So if you liked this and you want to hear more, stay on today. We're going to go into another webinar at 1 o'clock or noon Central Time, 1 o'clock Eastern, on how to effectively water landscape trees with Kelly Jackson. And so happy to have you on today. And then tomorrow, we're going to have 2 webinars. Dr. Muller talked about invasive plants, and we're going to have a webinar on invasive plants, as well as something that I think connects up when we think about climate and sustainability is how are we utilizing wood, and can we be doing that even more sustainably? A webinar on campus woods. So with that, again, let us know what you think. You can either follow the link that I dropped in the chat or get this QR code with your phone and complete the survey. And I want to turn it back over to Dr. Muller. So we did get a few questions in the chat, and one of them was about concern about fire. And you definitely referenced this. We have increased fire risk coming to our area. What can individuals be doing to prevent significant damage?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And it depends on the size of area that you're managing, what you have access to, right? From the very small scale of simply cleaning up the woodlands and making sure that there aren't a lot of what we call ladder fuels and other things that might allow fire to get up into the canopy, but also promoting species that are fire adapted. And fortunately for us, those species include oak, a number of different oak species that are able to tolerate fire, right? If you're managing on a larger area, actually using fire through prescribed fire can help reduce the risk of wildfire. Right, reintroduction of fire is a really important tool that we use that isn't necessarily available to all landowners or all sizes of areas, but focused on making sure that fire is able to, or the land is able to accommodate a low intensity of fire. Whatever that might look like is certainly the best way to help reduce the risk of severe impacts of fire.
Wonderful, thank you. Another question that we saw in the chat was, when's the best time to plant trees? Somebody has about 10 acres, so a small property, wanting to know when the best time to plant trees is. And they say that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, right? And the second best time is today. So, and I do think that today might actually be the answer, or right about now is a pretty good time, right?
Yeah, I would say so. As far as what changing climate might impact, I don't necessarily know, but obviously planting trees during a drought or a really dry period would be stressful on a young tree. And so whether it's across the growing season considerations or just these more local considerations would also be important to think about. And if that takes watering it, that's also likely going to be an important management of that young seedling.
I think that's a really good point, in that perhaps that might be a bigger consideration going forward if you are planting a lot of trees, and doing that in the spring, because that's when our nursery has a lot of seedlings available. If we do have those flash droughts, that could be really problematic for the trees that you just planted. So considering the fact that we're likely to have more of that, that could be an increased problem going forward. In general, the time of year to avoid planting in is the summertime in Kentucky. Now, there are exceptions to that, and not saying you can't be successful planting in the summertime. It's just going to require more watering because it's hotter, it's drier, versus if you're planting other times of the year, it's a little easier for those trees to recoup the loss of their root system. That being said, Bare root seedlings are available in the spring from our nursery and many other state nurseries. So that makes that a great time to plant those because they're available then. Any other things you wanted to share on that, Dr. Muller?
No, I think that's great. Yeah, you answered it well.
Any other questions? Well, I'm seeing a lot of comments in the chat about how much people appreciated your presentation. Where can folks find the Tree Atlas tool that you mentioned?
Yeah, the easiest way to find it is just to Google it. Type in Forest Service Tree Atlas, and it's HTML based. It's open to everyone, and you can just go on and play around with it and pull up different species and see how that's going to be impacted. You need to take it with a grain of salt that it is a model, and some of these nuanced things within the model might not necessarily apply broadly across the landscape, given different microsite conditions and things that you might be dealing with. But it's a good tool to get kind of just a broad assessment of the species and future ranges. So, yep.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Muller. And we are going to wrap up today's webinar. Again, if you loved this and want to get more information, check out the resources that Dr. Muller pointed you to, as well as the great things that he's developing, trainings and fact sheets and other webinars that you might want to check out. Really appreciate the work that he's doing in helping us and our trees be as well prepared as they can for what's going to happen in the future. In addition, if you liked what you saw today and want more webinars like this, not only check out what's coming in just 4 minutes, our next webinar with Kelly Jackson talking about effectively watering your landscape trees, but check out the From the Woods Today weekly webcast program that the Forestry and Natural Resources Extension team does. If you like this, we do this every week with different topics, so you're in for a treat. So with that, I'm going to stop our recording. Thanks again, everyone, for joining.